What's up, everybody? My name is Hayward Cheesebourough. I'm a fashion designer and textile artist. My clothing company name is Infinity Regalia. I've been sewing for about almost 4 years now. I started in February of 2017. Pretty much just started making clothes for my friends that go to music festivals and stuff like that. And it honestly kind of happened like on a whim. I had just made a pair of pants for myself randomly and put it on Instagram, and then my friends started liking it, started direct messaging me, asking me to make them things. So I figured I had to give the people what they want. Now, 4 years later, I'm actually making full-on outfits for people. I actually made this hoodie that I'm wearing right now. And it all started with me actually, I didn't know what I was doing at first, so I just started making scarves. Because in the festival community, they're usually outdoors for camping festivals. There is a lot of dust, so people will wear scarves usually like around their face or over their heads. And for me, it was really easy because a scarf is really just a rectangle. So while I was getting my bearings, like learning what I was doing with the sewing machine, all I really had to do was focus on sewing the border, the straight line around the rectangle. So from that, I learned how to make other things, and now I'm actually wearing stuff that I make now. Today's class, I'm going to be teaching you kind of like how I started, how to make a bookmark, because it's pretty much just a rectangle. And from there, you can also learn how to make things like bags. You can make like a small purse with the same kind of techniques that we're going to be doing today. If you add a zipper, like there's a purse in general. So it's a good thing pretty much to start out with that isn't too complicated, but also is like pretty fun if you have the right kind of fabrics. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the connections of different words when it comes to sewing. Something that I thought was really cool, I have this book here that I've been reading. It's called The Golden Thread. I don't know if you can see it, it's kind of bright. But in this book, it does talk about the entire history of textile production. And in part of the book that I thought was interesting, it said that the word text itself comes from the Latin root word, I believe, I'm not sure how to say this exactly, but I think it's texere, it's T-E-X-E-R-E. And that word actually means to weave. So from that word, we get textile, because textiles are woven individual threads that create a fabric. So I thought that was really interesting. Also, the word fabric comes from the Latin word fabrica, which means something skillfully produced. So when you think about someone fabricating a story, it also comes from the word of creating actual fabrics. So I thought that was really cool to incorporate, since this is an event for the library and we're working with fabric. And then also in history, apparently a lot of the first texts, the first books were used, like the first paper was used as discarded rags. And then they also used fabrics to protect books. Bookmakers actually use needle and thread to bind books together. So honestly, sewing is in a lot of things throughout your life that you didn't know at the same time. So we're gonna get into it. I'm going to first start out with the prep on how we're gonna be preparing before we actually get sewing. And then I will teach the people with the sewing machine what they need to do, and then while they're sewing with their machine, I'll go through the steps on how to hand sew. And we can get it on the close-up camera so you guys can actually see my hands on what I'm doing. But first off, in your kits, you guys should have gotten 2 different pieces of fabric. You should have gotten a couple needles, some bobby pins. We're gonna use this to place our fabrics together before we sew them. Some other tools that I use, but we're actually not gonna need today. This is called a seam ripper. It's a tiny little thing, but honestly, this saves my life in so many situations. So this guy right here has got a needle kind of on one end. It's got a little red ball so it doesn't cut the other parts of fabric. And this little groove in there, in between the red ball and the other needle, that's really sharp right there. I make a lot of mistakes and I made a lot of mistakes when I first started out. So when you first make a stitch and you make a mistake and you want to undo that stitch, this is where this guy comes in. You're going to get in between the threads and kind of just clip stitch by stitch. So this actually saved my life with a lot of projects when maybe I did a certain stitch when I didn't need to, or if I did one step in a project before another step was done. So if you do plan on going further in your sewing journey, you definitely are gonna need a seam ripper. You can get these at Joann's for like pretty cheap, like a couple bucks. They do have different sizes. You can get ones that are like this big as far as the handle piece. And other tools that we have, you guys aren't going to need to cut anything because the fabric is already to size, but you do need fabric scissors. These are mine. I got like some special ones that are kind of rainbow titanium colored. The thing about fabric scissors is you only want to cut fabric with them. These aren't something that you want to use to cut paper because paper will actually dull your scissors. And the more you have to sharpen them, the quicker you're gonna have to need to get new scissors. But when I'm not using scissors to actually cut out my fabric, once I have a pattern down, this is a rotary cutter. So this is actually kind of like a pizza slicer, but for fabric. So it's got a circular blade. This right here is the guard to make sure that you don't cut yourself. You always wanna be safe. And these things are actually, the handle of the rotary cutter isn't necessarily expensive, but the blades themselves are pretty expensive. These go like anywhere from about like 20 to 35 bucks. So this is something that you want to make sure your surface when you're cutting, there's not really any obstructions that are going to put a dent into your circular blade. Because while you're cutting, it will kind of end up being a perforated cut where parts of the fabric will actually still be attached because there's a dent in there that didn't get cut. So this is something that you always want to make sure is like in a safe place. These are really sharp. Just touching it sometimes, I've actually cut myself. So you want to be careful when you're using these. And that's all the tools I believe that I have for today. So if you guys want to go into your kit and grab out your 2 pieces of fabric, these are the fabrics that I chose for myself today. I like to use a lot of brocade fabric, which is what these are, or AKA satin brocade. So you're going to take the pieces, the parts of the fabric that you want to be shown on the outside of your bookmark. And I actually went ahead and made one last night as an example so you guys can see what it's going to look like on the end. This is one side of it. Here's the other side. And the edges of the fabric are all hidden like inside of itself. So this is what it's going to look like at the end. But as you can see, there's this side that looks good. And then there's the other side. This is what is on the inside of this. So whatever you want to show on the outside, you want to have those 2 pieces. In the sewing industry, we call it right side to right side. The other sides are the wrong side. So you want to face the right side to the right side of the fabric so you have the pieces that you want hidden actually showing right now. And then we are going to take our bobby pin. And really, it doesn't really matter where you put them as long as your fabric is kind of straight. It doesn't need to be super straight, or you don't need to be really strict about it. But you do pretty much want the edges lined up as best as you can. It's okay if you have like a little bit of fabric like popping out of the side. But what I usually do is I start at the corners on each side. So we'll do the left corner on a long side, and then you want to go to the other corner. Let me get this in there. And then once you have the corners done, you want to put one in the middle because fabric tends to move around a lot. So I always get my corners first to make sure that they're going to line up. And then you just kind of like stretch it to fill in that empty space. And you'll put one in the middle. And then we will do the same thing on the other side. So one bobby pin here, one bobby pin here. All right. And I mean, if you have an extra one, you can put one here in the center. I think that's all I have right now. But as you go, like sometimes when I first started out, I didn't have a ton of bobby pins. So as I was taking bobby pins out while I was sewing, I would actually take the ones that I've taken out and I would replace it into a spot that I needed it. If you need it, this is a pretty simple project. So if you don't have one in the center, it's really not going to be a big deal. It won't hurt you. So now we're going to start sewing, and I'm going to go over how to sew with the sewing machine first, and then for the two people with doing the hand needle, we'll switch to the overhead camera so you can actually see how to hand stitch it. But so the process of this, we're going to start on one corner here on the long side, and then go across, and then we're going to stitch across the short side, and we're going to stitch across the long side. So this second short side, on the side that we started at, we're not going to complete the circle or complete the rectangle and stitch this, because what's going to happen is we're going to sew along all these edges, and then once that's done, we're going to flip it inside out. So we still need a hole available in order to get the right sides onto the outside, if that makes sense. So if you guys can see my sewing machine here, you can go ahead and take out the first bobby pin because it's probably going to get in the way when you're trying to put it into the machine. But when you put it in, don't start at the very edge of the corner. You actually want to go in about maybe about ½ an inch to an inch, because after we flip it inside out, or I guess right side in, we're going to end up folding the edges. So if you start at the very end of the fabric, your thread is actually going to keep you from being able to flip the rest of the fabric in. So you kind of want to leave just a little bit before you start. So you want to place it in there. All right. So you can see how I have my fabric lined up to the side. This right here is called the foot of the sewing machine. So you pretty much want to be able to see just a little sliver of fabric coming out of the foot. And on my machine, it has these knobs right here. This is going to control your tension. Tension means how tight the thread is being pulled within what you're sewing. I usually have mine at about a 4 for projects like this. If you're gonna do projects that need the thread to stretch, like if you're making stretch leggings or something, you wanna go to maybe about a 2, or in between a 2 or a 3. For things where it's going to be stiff, you don't have to worry about stretch. 4 is fine enough, or you could go higher if you need to, but we're just going to stick at a 4. And then this little knob right here is going to show your needle placement. So you can have your needle in the neutral position, or this will have it move to the left a little bit. We're going to use the neutral position, not the far right. So I'm not sure if your guys' sewing machines have that, but most of them do. And then this button is for the width of your stitching. This is really if you're doing zigzag stitches. You can see this little line right here. It will show you, I think the smaller you get the number, the more straight the stitch is. The bigger the number, the more zigzag. If we're just going to be doing a straight stitch today, so it honestly doesn't matter what number it's on, but I usually like to keep mine just in the middle because you never know when you're going to change to something different. All right, so when we start stitching, we're going to do what's called back stitching. So you're going to stitch forward about 2 or 3 stitches, and then my machine has this reverse button right here. So I actually have to hold down this lever while I'm pressing down on my sewing pedal, and then that will make it go backwards and reverse. So if your guys' machine has that, I feel like all sewing machines should have it. I have a really old one at home too. It just depends on how your machine does it. You can either use the reverse, or you can place your needle down, you can lift up, and you can spin it around and then do 2 stitches back, and then just spin it back when you're ready to go forward again. So I got my needle placed in. I got about 1/2 inch of fabric towards the back side. So I'm going to hit my pedal. In another sewing tip, I'm not gonna do it today because I'm in public, but when I sew at home, I actually sew with my shoes off because having shoes on when you're trying to use your pedal, it just kind of takes away from being able to tell how far you're pressing down. I actually work at White's Boots in their sewing department. So 5 days a week. I actually worked today earlier. We were working overtime, but I got off early to come do this. My first day at White's Boots, I actually came in wearing some Doc Marten boots, and we actually use a big like industrial sewing machine. And I figured because it's a bigger machine with like a huge pedal that's probably like this big, my shoes wouldn't matter. But I actually saw a huge difference when I came in the second day because my boss told me, he's like, you need to just wear tennis shoes. Like you're wearing these like thick boots with like a sole like this big. And so he told me to like wear my Nikes when I came in, and it made a huge difference because the first day of work when I was trying to like get used to the machine, I couldn't really tell like how far I was pushing down. The throttle on these machines are very sensitive. So like I was actually, they had me practicing on practice leather. Thankfully, I wasn't making like real boots at the time, but there were times where like the sewing machine almost like got away from me. So as soon as I switched to tennis shoes, it really made a big difference. If you're at home and your parents don't mind you putting your bare foot on the sewing pedal, it might be easier for you to do that. But let me try to get my pedal in place real quick. All right, there we go. So we're going to do like 2-3 stitches, and then I'm pressing down on my lever, a few stitches back. And then now that you have that done, that's gonna keep your threads in place so that they're not gonna get loose and get undone. So now you can just go ahead and just do that all the way around the border, but make sure you stop at the end of the second long side. We want to keep that last short side near the beginning open so that we can do it inside out. And then while you guys are doing that, I'm going to teach the 2 people. Is it still just 2 people that are hand sewing? I guess it doesn't matter, but I'm going to teach you guys what you need to do to hand sew. So first things first, you need to thread your needle. Let me see if I can. All right, so when threading the needle by hand, what I usually do is you want to have as little like frayed thread as possible. So I snip mine with scissors, or you can bite it. I honestly end up biting my thread a lot because I just don't feel like grabbing my scissors because they'll be over on the other side of the room. But it shouldn't be too hard to try and thread it. Let me see. There we go. So you want to get the thread inside. You can see that my needle's like that. And you want to pull out a pretty decent amount of thread. It doesn't need to be enough to complete the entire project because you can always tie back in. But you don't want it to be so short where you have to keep rethreading your needle. I'm going to do like like a medium amount of thread because I'm actually not going to hand sew the entire thing for you guys. I'm going to do enough just to show you. But you want to have your needle in the middle of the thread. So you want to take the 2 ends of the thread once you cut it and bring them together. If you can see like that. And then pull the needle so you know that you have the perfect half and half amount. So with the 2 ends of the thread, you want to wrap around your finger. You want to just tie the thread around your finger to make a loop. Slide your finger out of that, And then the two edges of the thread that you have, you want to push that through the loop, both of them together. And pull it all the way. And then once you have the knot, you can either leave like the frayed end. Me, I like to try to be as neat as possible when I sew. So I'll actually like cut the thread right before the knot. And I'm gonna do it with our kit fabric. So you can see. All right. So just like the people who are using their sewing machine, you want to start at the corner, but like, you know, about ½ an inch below. And you're going to put your needle in, run it through. You want to leave like a little bit of slack though. Don't take it all the way to the knot. And then try to put your needle back through like about where the first hole was started. And then when you come back through, because your thread is tied together, you have like this loop. I'm going to take my needle, now that it's back through on the same side as where I started, I'm gonna put it through the loop, which is gonna make a closed off tie into the thread, into the fabric that we have. If that makes sense. All right, so now that we got that first part done, we have our knot started. You're going to put your needle maybe about 1/4 of an inch, you know, just a little bit, into the next part. You're gonna pull all the way through. Uh-oh, mine got stuck on the bobby pin. And then you're going to come back through about the same amount of length that first stitch was. So if you can see, I have like a little bit of length right here, and now my needle's coming out in a new spot about the same distance as that first stitch. You want to bring your needle through. And then we're actually going to re-put our needle in at the spot that the first stitch ended at. So you should have a gap between the ending of the first stitch and where your thread is coming out again. Now we're gonna go backwards and connect that line. And you're gonna put it through. Pull, and you don't want to pull, you don't need to pull super hard. Just make sure that the fabric is laying flat, because if you start to pull too hard, it's going to make the fabric gather. There are some sewing projects where that look is needed, like where you want a gathered look, but we're not doing that today. If you want to make your bookmark do that, you know, it's a free country. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but go for it. So now that loop has been created, you should be coming out on the other side. Now we're gonna like leapfrog it. So where the end of these two stitches is, you want to pop back out about the same amount of length as you did for that first one. So now that we came through from the back end, we're gonna go back and leapfrog back and touch the beginning of, or I guess the end of that second stitch and pull. And then you're pretty much just gonna do that the entire way, all the way along three sides. And then you're going to leave this end open. But let me see if I can show you what it looks like. It's a little blurry, but that's what those first 3 stitches look like. All right. So you guys who are sewing at home with sewing machines, by now you should have already finished sewing your first 3 sides. I'm gonna go ahead and do mine real quick to catch up with you guys. And then I lift up my foot and pivot, because if you don't lift up your foot before you make a pivot, you're actually risking making fabric bunch together. It's kind of going to give a negative effect on what you're trying to do. So I always lift up my foot to make sure that I can have the fabric laid down flat the way I want to. All right. So when I'm sewing, I always like to do, I call it like maintenance or like tidying up while I'm working. So I always like to cut off the threads as close as I can to the fabric. I mean, you can just cut it off so it's like off of the machine and then do all of that at the end. But as you start making more elaborate projects, like if you're making a jacket or a hoodie or something like that, there are a lot of different stitch lines. And if you're not doing maintenance, like you're gonna literally have to go through and look at every single ending of a thread and make sure that you cut off where that thread starts. The woman that actually was like my sewing guru, she taught me the basics of like how to use the machine and whatnot. I had made a scarf for her and I didn't do maintenance on it. And she actually makes like fur coats and like fur hoods and stuff like for people for music festivals and Burning Man. She does a lot of really neat stuff and makes a lot of her own clothes. I gave her a gift and I didn't do the maintenance on it. And she was excited about it. It looked really great, but then she like totally like called me out on like the threads that I had still hanging off of there. And I've like never forgotten that. And ever since that moment, I've made sure that I cut every thread like as soon as I finish the stitch. And it's actually helped me a lot since I've been making a lot more things. So we got this little hole pocket of our pouch. So what we're gonna do is, I call it birthing the project, or a reverse birth. So we're going to push it as far as we can. Turn it inside out, or right side in, however you wanna say it. And once you start getting to the ends, you're gonna notice that some of the fabric in the corner is gonna be tucked away in there. So if you guys have like a pin or something like that at home, like I have a pin here, you can actually like just take it, push it in, and you can make sure you get those corners to stick out so that the fabric isn't stuck in there. Sometimes, because right now the pin that I have is kind of fat on the end. Sometimes I'll even use my scissors because they have like, you know, more of a point to it. But if you do that, just make sure you're careful as to how far or how hard you're pushing in, because you don't want to actually cut through the fabric and ruin your project. And then you can also just like pinch the edges and roll them out as well. It doesn't have to be perfect. There's actually tools as well that you can buy at a sewing store. I can't remember the name of the tools, but it's almost like a plastic little knife or something like that that's actually used for exactly that. All right. So if you did it right, which I'm sure you guys did, so now all of your edges should be perfectly tucked away inside without you seeing any negative edges. There's my corners. I did a pretty good job of pinching it out. There is still like a little bit that I could get out if I wanted to, but with the bookmark, it doesn't really matter as much. If you're making like a jacket or actual clothing for people, depending on what it is, you know, you might actually want to go in there with a fine tip and push out as far as you can. All right, so the next step is when I'm making when I'm making like clothing that people are going to be wearing, when you're sewing, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making a border along the edge that we just created, which is going to, you know, tighten everything down and make it flat. You can see kind of on here how there's like a stitch line border around the one that I already completed. So we're going to be doing that part. Before doing that, normally if I were making like clothes or something like that, I do what's called pressing, which is where you're actually going to take an iron and an ironing board and you're going to flatten everything. Depending on what kind of fabric you're using, you have to be careful so that you don't damage the fabric. This that I'm using, the satin brocade, you don't want to have too much intense heat like directly on it. So what I do when I am working with fabric like this and I need to use the iron, I'll take like another regular cotton fabric and I'll lay it over the top and then I'll steam it to make sure that I'm actually still getting the effect that I need, but without damaging the project. So with these bookmarks, if you want to get, you know, really perfect with it, if you guys are at home and you do have an ironing board available, easily at hand. I couldn't really put that in the materials list for you guys because I don't think the library could really afford giving all of you guys an iron. But you can totally just, you know, press it out, which is going to make it easier for you to make sure that you're getting that straight edge. But because what we're doing is just a straight rectangle, it's pretty easy to just do it by hand. So I'll actually just like lay it down and I'll swipe my fingers over it a few times, which kind of preps it. And then for this side, the naked side that's still unsewn, you want to take your fingers and you want to push in a little bit. So you can see that you want to give about, you know, about ½ an inch of fabric to push in there. And then I usually like pinch and I do the same thing. Like if you have an iron, like this is definitely where the iron would come in handy because this fabric is loose, it hasn't been sewn yet. This is where I would take the iron and I would press it down because it's gonna make it more manageable. So you can see how mine already wants to come, you know, already out the way that it was before. So if you guys do have an iron at home, go ahead and iron that way, and I'm pretty sure it should just lay flat without trying to come undone. I actually don't have an iron here, so I'm kind of gonna show you guys an example of what it's like dealing without one. But if you did a pretty good job lining everything up, you can even give yourself an extra like inch to work with because all of this is gonna be hidden on the inside. So the amount of fabric that you push like into the bookmark in order to be able to seal it up, it really doesn't matter. What matters is, I guess, how long you want it to be. So you just have to keep an account for the more you push in, the shorter your bookmark will be. But these are already about like 11 inches long. So it's not gonna matter if you push it in like an extra inch just to make sure that your fabric doesn't come out while you're trying to sew it. But we're actually going to start now on one corner of the edge that we just tucked in. It's easiest to do this first so we don't have to try and tuck it after we do our pivot. So our first stitch is actually going to be across the short side that's still open. And then after that, we're going to go along the edge of all the other parts, and that should be a lot easier. So like before, how I said to give yourself about 1/2 inch and not to go directly to the corner, we're gonna ignore that rule this time. You're actually going to go to the exact corner, and you wanna do it like we did the first time, where the fabric is actually, right along the edge of the sewing foot. So you guys can see I have mine right there in the corner. There's a little sliver hanging out. This time what we're gonna do is, I like to make my borders like pretty close to the edge. So instead of using the middle of the needle placement, I'm gonna move it so that the needle is as far right as it can be. And once you have that done, you can actually use, what I like to do is I like to use my hand turn wheel. This wheel right here is going to control the needle going up and down. You guys should have noticed it spinning and stuff when you were doing your first stitches. So I'll hand turn and watch my needle go in to make sure that it's going in at the exact spot that I want it to. And the brocade that I'm using is like kind of thick. The stuff that came in your guys' pack is a lot thinner, so you shouldn't have problems. So the fabric I'm using, I don't know if you can hear it, but it just gave a crunch like when I turned into it. That's another reason why I like to hand turn for like the first stitch, because right in the corner is probably gonna be about the thickest area of fabric that you're gonna be sewing over. So it's safer actually to start inwards before you actually start hitting with your pedal, because I've broken a lot of needles when it comes down into it and I'm using the pedal, because the machine, like, it can't tell the resistance of fabric like a human can. The machine's just gonna go when it wants to go, depending on how hard you hit it. So actually when I work at White's Boots, because we actually work with leather, the needles that we use are really thick. It's almost like the kind of needle like a doctor would use to like draw blood or something like that. We actually have to wear safety glasses when we work, because we break needles all the time, and shrapnel can fly out and blind you or whatever. I've never had that problem working on my sewing machine at home. Every time I break a needle at home, it doesn't like shatter and fly out. But if you want to be safe and make sure that your eyes are 100% protected, go ahead and wear sewing or safety glasses. I don't want anybody blaming me if they lose an eyeball at home, but you should be fine. So now I got my needle in. We're along the edge. Make sure my foot placement is good on my pedal. And you're just gonna sew along the edge. And if you're having issues getting your fabric to move for that first stitch, because mine was like about to do that, if your fabric is just like staying in place and your needle is going but it's not moving forward, what I'll do is, I'm not sure where my little tool went, my seam ripper. I think I might have dropped it. But I'll take my seam ripper, like right now I'll just use a pin, but I'll place my seam ripper like underneath the foot onto the fabric and pinch it down with that needle, and I'll use that to gain traction, and I'll push along the fabric like as it's going, and that should help you like get a start. But once it gets started, it's pretty good at going by itself. All right, so we're gonna sew all the way along this edge. And then when you start coming to the end, that's when I'll use my hand to hand turn, because again, like, it's hard to get very precise sewing placements with just your foot. So when I'm starting to come to the end, I'll just hand sew and watch it to make sure that I'm not going off of the fabric or anywhere that I don't want to go. And you're gonna lift your pedal up. You're gonna pivot, push it back down. And then while you're going, what I do is, this is a step that, I take my time with, because even though your fabric looks straight, because unless you pressed it, if you pressed it with an iron, you shouldn't really have too much issues with the fabric going into itself. But even these edges here, they kind of want to go back in. So you'll be sewing along an edge, but you'll have extra fabric like within that sewing part. So what I do is I pinch the fabric and I kind of like, let me see, like as it's going through the machine, I'll find like that thick part of fabric that's already stitched on the inside, and I'll pinch and roll it and push it to the outside to make sure that every bit of fabric is getting sewn as close to that first stitch that we did as possible, if that makes sense. So that's why I like kind of take my time. I'll do about like 5 stitches or so, and then I'll stop, find that little like thick part on the inside, make sure it's pushed all the way to the right, and I'll stitch again. And you pretty much just want to do that all the way around until you end up meeting, you want to close the loop this time. The first time we didn't close the loop because there was a hole, but this time you want to go all the way back to the first part where you started. And then I'll hand sew. Boom. Lift up your pedal. Boom. And I'll let you guys finish that while I go over how to hand sew for the people who are hand sewing. And honestly, it's really the same process as before. The only difference is that, like I said, you're probably going to have like a little bit more trouble with the area that's open. So if you haven't used an iron to press it down, for the people that are hand sewing, that's where your bobby pins are going to come in. So for that area that you have pushed into itself, just take your bobby pins, and if you need to, because the fabric is being a little like hard to manage, the cotton fabric that they gave you guys should be easier to work with. Mine was a little extra like hard to work with just because I'm using like the thick satin brocade. But you can totally just use as many bobby pins as you need to keep it in place. Because you are hand sewing, like you have all the eyesight, like there's no sewing foot in the way for you to tell or not be able to tell like where your fabric is coming out. And you'll also be able to maneuver like in between stitches. So, I mean, you almost have like an advantage because you're hand sewing. You're more hands-on and able to deal with this issue than other people. But just the same thing, like I said, you want to tie off a knot, come back through the same hole that you started, and then close off that loop, and then just do the same leapfrogging technique that we did to sew all the way around the edge for the first time. And it's just going to take longer for you guys, really. So that's really the only difference with hand sewing than with the machine. The machine, it does use a bobbin, so there's 2 different threads being worked with at the same time, but yeah, it should work. So are there any questions? Because once you guys have finished the border, that is pretty much the last step, and it should look like this, and you have your bookmark made. So that's pretty much all that I have to teach on how to make the bookmarks, but I'll take any questions for people if they have any.
So we do have one question. If I turn on the overhead
Oh yeah, totally. All right, so I'm gonna have to thread my needle again real quick, so you'll get to see that. But when I'm threading the needle too, you kind of want to like lick it and run it through your lips just to make sure that all the pieces of thread are together. Because if it's frayed and a little poofy and whatnot, it's gonna make it a lot more difficult to get it through. Using the scissors to make a straight cut is also gonna help. All right, so 1 second. All right. So we're making our loop to make the knot in the thread after we've put the needle in. And then you're going to put the thread through that loop that you created. And then that makes a little knot. And let me get my other fabric. So the question again was to how to make that first knot or that first loop to secure the first stitch. Is that right?
I think it's how to tie off the thread when you're completely done.
Oh, when you're completely done? Okay, so at the end of your stitch when you're completely done, it's kind of, I do almost exactly the way that I start the stitch, because as you can see, the knot is on this side of the fabric. I pulled my needle through. I go back through the thread, the same place that I put the first hole at. And let's see. And then after it comes back through, I'll put it through the thread, like where that knot is made. I don't know if you can see too well, but like that's how we started the thread, right? Or started the stitch. So when I'm ending a stitch, what I'll do is I'll just go through the fabric underneath, like where I had just sewn. Shoot, let me turn this light off. So let's say like this is where the stitch had started, right? Or like where you're about to end. I would just go underneath the fabric just a little bit and then pop right back out over it. And then I would go in between the two threads that are connected to the needle on the other side and pull it through that loop. And that will make a closed loop for you, if that makes sense. And you can do that, like sometimes I'll do it like 2 or 3 times just to make sure I have a stronger knot. But you don't exactly need to go all the way through the fabric and then back again and loop it. Like just going underneath the knot that you already made, or the last stitch that you already made, and going through like, you know, just a sliver of the fabric, and then coming out, and then in between the 2 threads that are still trying to go through the fabric that you just went through. That will close it off for you.
You sew along the outside border. And also was wondering, do you recommend clipping the extra fabric on the corners before you turn inside out?
Oh, the fabric on the corners? Yes, you can clip it. I totally forgot to say that part. I mean, it's not, you don't like necessarily need to do it for this project, but there are projects where, like I said, you need to have more of a point and make sure that's out there. Clipping the corners. So let's say our stitch, you know, we've stitched along here and we're gonna turn it inside out. I would snip the corner and give it like a little straightness, but you want to make sure you don't get too close to the stitch that you already made, because then that's gonna cut it. Even if you don't touch the thread and it's super close, just turning it inside out is could possibly create a gap in between the spaces that depending on how wide your stitch line is, it could make a hole or something like that. So you can clip it. That would make it a lot easier. It probably would have made it easier for mine as well. Like I said, I'm still learning, so I kind of forget little tips like this. But what was the other part of the question? Was it where you start the stitch?
So the second part of the question, I think, is, person who asked, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is after you turned it inside out, then you're re-sewing the outside border. Where on the outside border do you sew?
So you can see, this is the one that I've been doing in the class. You can see my stitch line right here. So it's about like maybe 1/4 of an inch from the edge. So if you, like this part I haven't even finished yet, you can start like in the corner and then just stitch along. And honestly, like it just depends on you, like how you want it to look. The way that I taught it for the sewing machine was just the easiest to make a straight line, because the foot actually, like if you have, let me see, if you keep it lined up with the foot and sew, the foot like almost guarantees a straight stitch as long as the edge of your fabric is along the edge of the foot. If you're hand sewing, you can honestly do it like however you want. You can go deeper into here, you can go closer to the edge. It just depends on the look that you want. So this is how far the needle came in from the foot. But again, like hand sewing, you can follow that same line, or you can do it like extremely close, or you can give it like a little thicker border and do it like in here. Oh, shoot. Me, I'm like, I'm a Sagittarius, so I like, new and exciting things. So honestly, like, whatever my current project is, usually ends up being like my favorite one, up until the point where like I have to do it a lot, then it kind of gets boring. Like when I started making face masks, like, the first few, they were great. I loved doing them. And then when people kept ordering more, I was almost like, all right, I'm kind of done with this. I want to make something new and exciting. But I guess my forte, the thing that I make best, that I almost like never get bored of, is I like to make bomber jackets. So the process of making jackets is pretty much the same, but I always end up using like different fabrics and making something that looks completely different. So I really like making jackets, as well as like mainly because with the jacket, there's so much that you can do with it. Like I'll end up making like secret pockets in my jacket sometimes. Like I'll put like a zipper pocket in the hood, like of a jacket, or like in the sleeve or something like that. I have friends that went to Burning Man like a couple of years ago, and they ordered like a couple fur coats from me, and I actually put like a secret pocket like in the sleeve for them, like in each one of them. I recently have been making hoodies, kind of like the one that I'm making now, or wearing now. I've actually like really gotten into making those in like a bunch of different styles. The one that I'm wearing now is actually reversible. So I don't know if you can see, it's kind of like a red zebra print, and it's like plush. That's actually the whole body of this on the other side. And then the sleeves are like a different material. So, I mean, I really like making like jackets and hoodies because it's a little bit easier to, like, everyone loves hoodies, and like even if it's baggy, like girls love to wear like oversized hoodies or like steal them from their boyfriends. So like, you know, it's a little bit easier to make for people's sizes and stuff. But yeah, I feel like that would probably be my favorite. But I've made like tons of things, all kinds of things. I'll make like hoods too for friends for festivals. Like not a jacket, but like literally just the hood. What else have I done? I'll make kimonos for people sometimes. Those are fun because like depending on the fabric that you use, it can look really cool. But honestly, like the actual construction of a kimono doesn't take as much, you know, I don't want to say skill, like it still takes skill, but it doesn't take as much attention, or there aren't as many steps to make a kimono as there are to make a jacket.
Did you have to experiment with different like fabrics and materials as well? What works well for certain projects, what doesn't?
Yeah, when I first started out, I made a lot of mistakes. Not so much mistakes, but I did learn a lot about different fabric types, and not only like what fabrics work best for the project, but you also need to know like what needle works best for certain fabrics. So like if you're making something out of like a stretchy material, I've had like moments where like I've just been sitting at my machine super frustrated because the machine is going up and down, but the threading will either like break or it will knot up or like it won't look right or something like that. And it took me like a bunch of mistakes to realize that like either like one, I was using the wrong needle, or two, I had the tension set wrong. Like sometimes the tension will affect that. Sometimes it's even like the type of stitch that you're doing, if it's zigzag or not. So I mean, I did learn that when I'm making like almost like stretch leggings or something like that, I do need to use like a specific needle. There is like a certain type of fabric that works better. Also with stretch fabrics, like not all stretch fabrics stretch at the same rate. Some of them like do have some stretch to them, but it's a little tight. There's fabric that has like what's called four-way stretch. So it will stretch side to side and up and down. And then other ones will only stretch like side to side. So I've made like a couple items before where like I almost assumed that it would have the same stretch as something that I had made before. And then it stretches a little tighter, like not as much as the last thing. So it actually ended up being like too tight on the person that I made it for, and I had to go back and get like more fabric or something like that. But that's why YouTube, YouTube, and do your research before you start a project. It will save your life and a lot of frustration. And then yeah, if you guys are looking for a book to use to try out your new bookmarks with, I highly recommend this book. It's called The Golden Thread. The author's name is Cassia St. Clair. Cassia is like Kassia. I honestly, I haven't even finished this book yet. I don't know if the library holds it. I bought this off of Amazon. But it's a really interesting book that they start talking about like literally the very first fabric, or like the first thread that they found like fossilized like in a cave, like the earliest sign of like man making textiles and stuff like that. So they start there, and then they literally just like continue the journey of like how man started pretty much like producing textiles and using things. They talk about like mummies and how mummies were wrapped in linens and things like that, and how the Egyptians actually saw like linens almost as like, don't quote me on this because I read this part like a while ago, but you can read the book and make sure it's right. But I think that like linens had something to do with like, you know, reaching the afterlife, or almost helping the dead or spirits like get to the afterlife. Linens like were very like valuable to them. I don't know if they used them as currency, But they also talk about how silk started. The Yellow Emperor, like his wife, way back in the day of like Neolithic China, she actually like found out about silk. The legend goes that she was like chilling underneath this mulberry tree, drinking tea, and because where silk comes from is from like a silk worm that lives in a certain type of tree called a mulberry tree, and they eat all of the leaves, and then they create a cocoon like a caterpillar would. And that cocoon that they make is actually like spun silk. So she was hanging out underneath this tree, and then one of these cocoons like fell into her cup of tea, and the hot water actually allowed all of like the spools of silk thread to like kind of disperse. And then like she was like mesmerized by like the color of it and stuff, and like as to how much of the thread like was able to come out of it. I think like the legend says that like she was able to spread like one of these silk balls like across like a portion of a field of flowers or something like that. But I think her name is Shay Lin or something like that. Don't quote me, read the book to make sure. But yeah, she actually spearheaded silk production in China. So I think like she invented like the very first silk loom, and got all of her like subjects and stuff to start like creating silk. And then like years later after that, silk was actually it was like a currency like in China. They would actually like tax people on like how many like bolts of silk that they could make or like produce, and like they would have to like turn it over to like their government. And like a bolt is a certain measurement of fabric. I can't exactly remember like how long it is, but like yeah, people were like required to make like bolts of silk, and then that was like a currency of theirs. If it's taking you a long time to hand sew, don't feel bad, because that's just the process of hand sewing. Oh yeah, one of the fun facts that I had for today that I just realized I didn't say is that a lot of stories, like when I was a kid, I was always fascinated on like, you know, certain like jokes and stories that were like commonly known to like almost everyone, but no one knew like who wrote it or like came up with it. One of the things that I learned from this book is actually that a lot of that came from, you know, sewing, because when people were doing that back in the day before they had TVs, like sometimes before they even had books, it was almost like a household, like family thing to know how to sew. And like, you know, they would make their own bags, like they would repair their own clothes and stuff like that. And it took a long time to do that kind of stuff. So naturally, like they ended up like sharing stories, like while like instead of like sharing stories around a campfire, they like shared stories like around a sewing circle, like while they were just doing their work. And a lot of stories, like that's why a lot of stories do kind of have references and words and phrases that do derive from sewing, because like that's what they were doing like when they created this stuff. Like correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure like the story of like Rumpelstiltskin, like doesn't he like sew golden thread or something like that, or I don't know, or like yeah, like I think that was like one of the stories that like, you know, was kind of made from somebody who was like sewing all the time. So if you're taking a long time, like just know that people were taking a super long time like years and years ago and always will. Which is why somebody got lazy and created the sewing machine, because they're like, I can't take this waiting anymore. And to be honest, like if the sewing machine didn't exist, I don't know if I would be making clothes. Like I don't have that kind of patience. So I really only hand sew when I absolutely have to. Like if it's a type of material that like just won't go through my sewing machine, because there are some materials that are like really sticky on the surface. So with the metal foot, like when it presses down, it, you know, just doesn't want to let the fabric go. And so there's been a couple projects where like, you know, I've had to go ahead and bite the bullet and hand sew that one section just to make sure that it comes out neat. But for the most part, like, I try to use my machine as much as possible. And even using my machine, I lose patience. So I just like want it to be done. Like, I'm more of a designer than I am like a sewer. I just learned how to sew because, you know, I didn't go to like design schools. I don't have a manufacturer or something for me to just write out, you know, my idea and then be like, all right, make this. So I kind of just took the hands-on approach to I'll do it myself. But yeah, like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen like one of my favorite TV shows, not the current season, but the old seasons of Project Runway. There will be people on that show who literally have never sewn in their life, like never used a sewing machine. Like, they draw up designs and they create ideas for like clothing and stuff, and then they let somebody else do all like the hard stuff. But at the same time, those contestants on the show usually don't last as long. I don't think I've ever seen one of those people like win a season. So, I mean, even though I'm impatient, I do like being self-sufficient and like knowing the entire process through, the entire steps like through a process. Because, like, you know, I want to own, hopefully, well, I do own my own business, but I want my business to grow to the point where I do have manufacturers to create my clothing, so that I can spend more time just like designing and perfecting designs and stuff like that. But I feel like it's important to know all the steps that need to be taken for the people that are going to be doing that for you. Because like the more that you know, you can understand where they're coming from. So you'll know like what's able to be done, how hard it could be to do something, how long it would take. And it's just going to be easier for you to like make those business decisions. If like you have a deadline and you have this like really great idea, but you as a designer don't understand that it's going to take like 3 times as long to produce that idea. So you can either, 1, come up with like a better solution that's different that won't take as long, or 2, you can have extra time to start earlier on that process to make it happen for you the way that you want.